So this is incredibly cool. This is in the Hill. They say, voters in Denver approved a referendum Tuesday decriminalizing psilocybin, the psychoactive substance in hallucinogenic magic mushrooms. Final results were released Wednesday afternoon, showing 50.6% of the 176,000 voters approving the referendum and 49.4% voting no. Initiative 301 will require police to make arresting people for personal possession or use of psilocybin mushrooms the lowest law enforcement priority in the city and county of Denver. The measure does not legalize psilocybin. Hallucinogenic mushrooms remain illegal in Denver and the rest of Colorado, and selling them is still a felony. All right, so let's just be crystal clear about what this is, because there's a little bit of confusion out there. Decriminalization is not the same thing as legalization. Legalization means, you can go to the store, the local store, and even though there could be regulations, you can buy the product. So you can, go to a Walgreens or a CVS or a fucking mushroom store or whatever and say, I would like to purchase some magic mushrooms, please. That is legalization. Decriminalization is, it's still illegal to sell it, but it's not a criminal penalty if you're caught with it. You understand? So there's definitely a distinction. Step one in the march towards freedom here is decriminalization. That's step one in going in the right direction towards freedom and liberty. Step two would be legalization, but it's freaking awesome that now we have a situation where we've gone beyond marijuana now. Because marijuana, everybody knows, is still illegal at the federal level, but you have so many states who've legalized it even for recreational use, and the federal government's being kind of hands-off with that, at least at the moment, which is a good thing. But now we're finally starting to have the conversation even beyond marijuana, and now they're talking about psychoactive substances. Now, I'm not the kind of person who jives well with hallucinogenic substances, psychedelic substances, but there's a lot of scientific data that points to the conclusion that these are very beneficial and they are transformative for many people. They're, these are substances that can give people epiphanies and can really change their lives. And I'd be a fool to not recognize that, even though these are not my preferred substances. There's reason to believe that this is going to have tremendous beneficial effects for people. Now, that also doesn't mean that there's no such thing as a bad trip, because there is. But, is that a risk that we should be willing to take? I think yes. If you can go to the fucking store at 5 o'clock in the morning and get yourself, 3 bottles of gin and drink yourself into a stupor, yeah, of course you should be able to take a substance like this, which has way more upsides. And by the way, it is not at all addictive. Psychedelic substances you do not get addicted to. It's just a total different classification of drug, of substance, than what you would normally think of when you think of substances like cocaine or something, which can be very addictive. Psychedelic drugs, hallucinogenic drugs, they are not addictive. So that would stem from a fundamental misunderstanding from people who would argue that, something, oh my God, people are going to be addicted to mushrooms. That's not a thing. That doesn't happen. So even less so than weed, because they say weed is psychologically addictive but not physically addictive. But you could argue there's at least some level of addiction there. With psychedelic substances, at least from my understanding of everything I've read about it, is there's no fear of addiction. So I think it's wonderful that they decriminalize it. I think they should go even further and legalize it, but that's just me. When it comes to social issues, I'm super libertarian, and I believe in freedom, and I believe in you should basically be able to do whatever you want to do as long as you're not hurting anybody else. And I think if we actually wanted to abide by that principle, we would move in that direction. With most drugs, I don't think the psychological or the societal, I should say, downsides of these drugs being legal, I don't think that outweighs what it is with them illegal. So in other words, we have more problems associated with all these drugs when drugs are illegal, because then all these drugs go to the black market. When they're on the black market, there's a giant spike in crime. There's a giant spike in mafia activity, so organized crime. Violence shoots through the roof. So the way that you get rid of the violent crime aspect of this stuff is to legalize, tax, and regulate drugs, because then you wipe out the black market. And when you wipe out the black market, the criminals are not in the market. So it's much better to go to a safe store with a security guard and people wearing suits and ties and, go get your drugs that way than go to some back alley where there's somebody laying there on the ground who OD'd and somebody waiting to rob you right around the corner. So, this stuff is relatively obvious, and we learn from Prohibition, but we still have Prohibition with most drugs. So that makes no sense. And this is definitely a great step in the right direction. And I think people are going to be surprised as to, even if they were to legalize it, I think people would be surprised as to there's not that much of a spike in people using it. Because that's what we've seen. That's what the evidence that's come out to this point with other drugs, that's what we've seen. It's not like there's a giant spike in people doing substances once you legalize them. The trend is clear. And I do think that over time, specifically on social issues, we're just going to get more and more open-minded, more and more tolerant, and we're going to be okay with more and more freedom. And I think that that's a good thing. I think that on economic issues, we're fighting a tsunami of resistance, corporate resistance. So in other words, when we try to make giant leaps and get to the proper positions on economic issues, we struggle because there's so much big money and lobbying on the other side. And, they want to prevent the minimum wage from being a living wage. They want to prevent everybody from having Medicare for all. They want to prevent free college. So it's much harder on economic issues for us to make gains. But on social issues, we can make gains because oftentimes the lobbying effort against these issues isn't as strong. It's still there. It's still there. Believe me, the DEA does not want any of these drugs being legalized or decriminalized. Believe me that the alcohol companies don't want any of these drugs legalized or decriminalized because they view it as competition. But still, the lobbying efforts are not that strong, and now there's a blossoming industry on the other side that can do counter-lobbying efforts. So definitely a step in the right direction and really interesting. And Denver and Colorado in general, they really lead the way on a lot of these issues, and credit to them.